Thanks for coming out, everybody. Thank you very much. I want to first thank Nerd Nite for having me back. I'm honored to have joined the club of people who have spoken 3 times, so I really appreciate that you all continue to enjoy what I have to say. Also, I need to get the most important thing I need to share with you this evening before I get on to my talk, which is I just want to share that it is my brilliant and beautiful partner Heather's birthday. So everybody wish Heather a happy birthday. So, yeah, I can't top that. So I've spoken to Nerd Nite a couple times at this point. Previously did a talk on the history of tete noir films, and did another talk on the history of net neutrality. So here today with you, I'm going to give you a talk that I have given before, actually to a local chapter of the Mensa Society, of all things, that I created in the pre-COVID times. There may be a few details that are slightly out of date on this presentation. I may be a little rusty on a few things, so bear with me, and we will all get through this together. Also, a little more about me. So basically, I'm a full-stack software engineer here in Austin. I work for a political tech company. But when I'm not doing that, I am the current president of the board at EFF Austin, who is a, thank you. We are a local digital civil liberties organization who are closely affiliated with Electronic Frontier Foundation out of San Francisco. If you've never heard of them, they're the nation's oldest and largest digital civil liberties advocacy organization. They're basically the ACLU for the internet and emerging technologies, protecting your right to speak, your right to privacy, etc. So they're very good people and do very good work, and we're honored to be associated with them. If you'd like to join our community and learn more, we have monthly meetups the second Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. at Capitol Factory downtown. You can learn more on our meetup on our Facebook, our Twitter, and our website, effaustin.org. Okay, got all the boring self-advertisement out of the way. So, gonna get on to my talk here, which is basically, I thought it'd be very interesting, I think, privacy around modern technology has become a lot more of a concern that, plenty of people are aware of, even people who aren't very technological. It's in the news a lot. I think a lot of people have just a sense that, there are problems here, but they may not, it's sort of like we hear about it a lot, but do we maybe have the full background that undergirds these debates and can help us inform our knowledge on this stuff? So I thought it'd be kind of fun to do a talk that explored almost the history of privacy as a concept and how it intersects with and relates to some places privacy manifests and how we use modern tools online. So, without further ado, I will get into nothing to hide, yet everything to fear, privacy in the digital age. Okay, it works. So, you may not know this, but privacy is a universal human right. It's true. After World War II, the United Nations put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because they wanted to prevent the atrocities that happened in that war from ever happening again by establishing an international framework of basic human rights. And privacy is one of those ones, as defined in Article 12, freedom from interference with privacy, family, home, and correspondence. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. So, a little bit of background about how we got to privacy being declared a universal human right. So, a very famous man who's one of the fathers of the internet, Vint Cerf, he is the co-creator of the TCP protocol in 1983, which is what allowed Tim Berners-Lee to create HTTP and create the World Wide Web. So, Vint Cerf famously quipped one time, privacy may actually be an anomaly, historically speaking, that a lot of some of the privacy that we kind of take for granted in our lives has not actually been the norm throughout a lot of human history and human societies. There was little to nothing of what we all would consider privacy in hunter-gatherer societies. They were very group-based social structures, and everybody's mostly caring about, survival, so, not necessarily concerned about privacy. But even the early philosophers in ancient Greece had already started to develop ideas of an understanding that there was a personal space people possessed, something that, was separate from their relationship with their community. Aristotle distinguished between the polos, which was one's duty as a public citizen who, was a public figure and had an obligation to vote and manage the society. He distinguished between that and the oikos, which means several things when you translate it, but it's essentially the household. And the understanding that one's household was in some ways a special space that deserved its own rights and privileges, separate from one's obligations to the polis. Now, further things throughout the Middle Ages continued to contribute to a sense of that there were certain spaces that were one's own and did not belong to society at large. For a lot of human history, buildings that ordinary people lived in were literally one-room buildings. There were not multiple rooms or interior walls in the building. So during the Middle Ages, as interior walls became more and more common, people started getting a sense of maybe even privacy from their own family, a space in their home that was theirs. Also, believe it or not, the innovation in the Middle Ages of the Catholic Church's idea of confession also furthered the concept of privacy. The idea that there were certain things that were between you and God and no one else, and it was actually an immense moral crime for a priest to reveal those things told to him because they were for God and the person confessing. Also, for a long time, people didn't really have their own bed, actually. And it's actually only in the last several hundred years that, people aren't, a whole family sleeping in a single bed or a single bedroom. So, as you can see here, a lot of this involves, as we get more and more to modernity, more and more people are essentially getting the luxury of privacy. Because for most of human history, privacy was a luxury good. The rich and powerful could have it if they wanted it, but ordinary people didn't really expect to have what we might call privacy. And you could almost say that much like many other things during the Industrial Revolution, privacy was made profitable for the masses. Now, really what we think of as the modern legal right to privacy, which ultimately culminated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was invented, and I mean literally kind of invented, by Louis Brandeis, who was a future Supreme Court Justice of the United States, but he conceived of what we generally would think of as the right to privacy in an 1890 Harvard Law Review article, which you can go find online. I recommend you read it. It's very informative. But his definition of the right to privacy was the right to be left alone. Specifically, he was responding, once again, to the ways technology was changing people's relationship to society and affecting their privacy. When he was writing, there was the rise of mass photography and also the rise of yellow journalism, fake news, essentially. And so he started wanting to push back against these technological developments and say that, people had a right to their private life. However, I will say that compared to when I first wrote this talk, I did learn some more things about Louis Brandeis, which I think I will quickly mention just because I think they're illustrative about everything in history is complicated. It should also be noted that Louis Brandeis was from an extremely wealthy, powerful, I believe, Boston family, and he basically, was a rich, powerful person who didn't want newspapers reporting on his doings, actually. So, worth keeping in mind that the guy may have been somewhat self-interested when he came up with all this stuff. So, to keep in mind. But I think that just also shows rights often compete with each other. It's hard to have absolutes. But to go further, it's important to understand, and actually certain recent legal events I think have made a lot of people understand this more, that the U.S. Constitution does not have an amendment that explicitly guarantees a right to privacy. We are actually something of a legal anomaly in the world with this. Over 150 sovereign nations around the world have an explicit right to privacy in their constitutions. The United States does not. It only implicitly has one because of the legal casework established by Brandeis and others. It's been ruled to be implicitly guaranteed by the First, Third, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments, and also more recently by the Ninth and 14th Amendments, although recent legal developments have called that justification into a murky water, which I can certainly get into more later. I mentioned to you that for a lot of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and early 20th century, privacy stopped being a luxury good and was available to the masses. And basically, as long as privacy was profitable, it was protected. Because, of course, you could sell people a lot of these new innovations, bigger houses with more rooms, more beds, you know. So there was no reason not to give people more privacy. It made everybody money. But it turns out that, once again, technology is driving some trends that are now, once again, threatening to turn privacy into a luxury good. You may have heard the quip, data is the new oil. And what's meant by that, basically, is just that large collections of data on all of us are incredibly valuable, financially speaking. And computers and the internet have made the easy availability to collect mass data on all of us extremely easy and extremely profitable. So it turns out it is no longer in these companies' interests for us to have privacy. They make money by violating our privacy. So one defense a lot of companies will give you when they talk about they're collecting all this data is they'll say, well, we anonymize the data. We strip it of anything that could let any individual record you know who it is. The industry term for this is personally identifiable information, or PII. They will claim to have stripped this PII from the data sets before they start selling it on the third-party data broker market. Now, and it turns out actually that anonymizing the data is one of the requirements of Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which you may have heard of, and actually which EFF Austin recently had a talk from a subject area expert on it. I will hopefully have the YouTube video of that up shortly if you'd like to learn more. So despite these safeguards and these companies' claims, it turns out it is actually really shockingly easy a lot of the time to re-identify a person from an anonymized data set. One of my favorite stories of this is, and in a blurb I have up there, is that basically a New York City researcher took a bunch of publicly available paparazzi photos of celebrities getting into New York City taxi cabs, and he then went to the publicly available data set of New York City taxi cab travel routes. That data set had been anonymized in that you didn't know what route was what person, but with the pictures, he could take the location data, and he was able to easily reverse engineer where all these celebrities had gone on their trips, basically. So wasn't very hard if you wanted to get some dirt on these celebrities to figure out everywhere they were going in their private lives. Also, according to a study that Imperial College London did, you really don't need that many unique data points about people to know who everybody is, even if it's anonymized. But according to their research, with as little as 15 unique data points on people, you can uniquely identify 99.98% of people. So anytime a company claims they don't need to do more to protect your privacy because they anonymized it, you can tell them that claim doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. So now I'm going to go through a few examples of what's happened when certain companies have violated our privacy in recent years. Some of you may remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but to briefly refresh it for some of you, Alexander Kogan was contracted by the predictive analytics firm Cambridge Analytica. They basically hired him to build an app to harvest Facebook user data. The app presented itself as a quiz, and so a user using the app might just assume, oh, well, of course it'll log my answers to the quiz, maybe a few pieces of data about me, but due to lack of safeguards in Facebook's API at the time, the app was able to scrape not only every piece of data on somebody's profile who used the app, it could scrape every piece of data of everyone they were friends with, even if none of those people had used the app. So it allowed Cambridge Analytica to compile highly detailed profiles of people, which they then promptly sold to political campaigns that then could use Facebook's ad buying metrics and algorithms to send highly targeted political propaganda at various people based on everything they'd learned about a bunch of people who had not consented for them to be able to learn all this stuff about them. Another recent example of privacy violations is showing that it is not just corporations who engage in this behavior. So I'm sure most of us remember back in the rosy days of 2013 that we all learned, thanks to the revelations of whistleblower Edward Snowden to reporters Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, that the NSA was conducting a program called PRISM with various large tech companies. Essentially, under PRISM, the NSA was forcing all the big tech companies to turn over all their customer records. No warrants required, just give us all the data on everyone. And the big tech companies were under gag orders and forbidden from talking about it. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Email, chat, video, photos, stored data, VoIP, social network contacts, all of it was made freely available. The NSA exploited a law, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was established in the late 70s, and when it was written pre-internet, the law had safeguards of saying, well, this surveillance is only for people overseas. But it turns out the line between when a communication is overseas or not, when you're online, is incredibly blurry. A packet can get routed out of your country and then routed back into your country. So even though you're talking to somebody in your country, they can essentially claim, oh, well, the data left the US for a minute, therefore this law lets us snoop on it, basically. Yeah, that wasn't great. So yeah, and you know, obviously not to leave Google out. So, you know, I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point, but I'll just hammer it home again. You know, it is no exaggeration. Google tracks everything everyone does online. And it's worth paying them more attention just because of their reach. As you can see, literally billions of people use all their products. And in addition to that, even if you think, well, I won't use Google products, well, it turns out almost every website online has a little JavaScript bundle called Google Analytics running on it, which basically lets them gather data on you when you visit almost any website online, even ones Google does not run. So, yeah, it's pretty ubiquitous. And not limited to the US. You know, I think we all frequently hear about some of the crazy things China gets up to on the surveillance front, but possibly the one that is the most egregious, because it's literally the plot of a Black Mirror episode, is their emerging concept of the citizen social credit score, which it's basically what it sounds like, where you're basically, unlike a traditional credit report where only your finances go into it, the social credit score takes into account all sorts of things like, oh, did you jaywalk? Did you help that elderly person cross the street? Because there's a ubiquitous network of facial recognition software everywhere, from lampposts to drones to even police officers' glasses. So literally every waking moment, every action you're making is logged, and they are not benign consequences. Just like a normal credit score in the US, there are major financial penalties to having a low social credit score. If it gets low enough in China, you literally actually can't take trains or planes. You can't take them. You're not allowed on them. So you may have heard all these examples and maybe go, and you know, frankly, you know, we hear the drumbeat of this in the news every day. You may go like, well, this feels like fighting a losing battle. And I'm like, as an activist in this stuff, believe me, I know. I often think of Kurt Vonnegut has a famous thing he says in Slaughterhouse-Five about, like, you know, they say writing anti-war book is like writing an anti-glacier book. Pointless, got to do it anyway, though. But, you know, why do I think privacy is still worth fighting for? And why is it a universal human right? Why is it a value that's so important? I'd argue for a few reasons, but one of the most important is I view privacy as a power equalizer. It is a way for people with not a lot of power in this world to protect themselves and be on more even footing from those with power. And another virtue I think of it is that privacy lets society experiment with new ideas, because however enlightened a society, you know, it's going to get some things wrong. And there is always social pressure to conform. And I really don't think I am making what I consider a controversial statement to be that many of the rights that we over the last couple hundred years have won in the United States, ending slavery, extending suffrage to women, granting gay marriage, decriminalizing marijuana, etc., I don't think any of these things would have happened without a right to privacy. Because people have a right to have a safe space to explore new ways to organize and arrange society. Unless you like society just the way it is, I think you're a fan of privacy. And also, just to combat the really annoying phrase people who are pro-surveillance often offer of, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, well, you may have nothing to hide right now, but who's running the government and who is empowering your society can always change. You may have nothing to hide right now, That could not be true tomorrow. The people suddenly running things, something that you thought was benign about the way you live your life, they suddenly have a major problem with. So what are some steps you can take to protect your privacy? I had a few tips here. I'm also going to rattle off one or two more because I realized this slide was showing its age from the talk was written 3 years ago. But use web browsers that respect your privacy. Firefox and Brave are a couple ones that do good work on that front. You can use alternative search engines to Google. Yes, they still exist. DuckDuckGo is a fairly famous one. Another one's called StartPage. But there are alternatives to Google that are more privacy respecting. You can install browser plugins that help enhance the privacy of your online experiences. One place where this talk's slightly out of date is that, so the HTTPS Everywhere plugin was actually a web browser plugin the Electronic Frontier Foundation created to make sure all your web sessions are encrypted so that nobody can snoop on them. But it turns out that the plugin is no longer needed because all major browsers now support this functionality out of the box. So EFF basically won this one. But they still recommend Privacy Badger, which is basically their ad blocker, but it doesn't use a fixed whitelist. It basically kind of learns over time what things are tracking you, so it's a little more sophisticated than a lot of them. It's a little harder to defeat by a clever surveiller. Also, you can get a VPN to try to mask your location and some of your activities online. TunnelBear is a good one. Proton Mail, who you may have heard of, also makes a good one called Proton VPN. A bullet point that is not on here that should be on here is get yourself an end-to-end encrypted email service. The two ones I would recommend are, as I said, either Proton Mail or Tutanota. They're both good options if you want something where even your email provider cannot see the contents of your email, because Google and Gmail can absolutely read your emails if they want to. And finally, make your phone calls and video chat with a true end-to-end encrypted app, something like the Signal messaging app. So, you know, there are little things you can do to start wrestling your privacy back and making your personal communications and space your own again. And I realize I've been rambling for a while, so I'm going to try to wrap it up here with some inspiring words from a man mentioned earlier in the talk, from Edward Snowden here. Arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. So, yeah. I was just going to yell at everybody, but okay. Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the evening, we would ask, if you have things to ask, that you ask them. So, does anybody have any questions for our speaker? All right, we're going to start over here. I want to come over there, and we're going to say this into the microphone so it makes it into the live stream.
How do you figure out your privacy or your rights when you may have, like, back-to-back privacy statements and as you're navigating through different sites? The scenario for this is doing online surveys, and they route you through different companies to determine your eligibility, and you may go through 5 or 6 within 5 minutes. They also have a strategy of identifying you individually by your machine configuration and then sharing that with the rest of the industry so you don't do duplicate surveys.
Yeah, just to kind of re-summarize real quick, do you have any tips for situations where someone might be passed through a number of different services quickly?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say exercise caution if that happens. Maybe do a little bit of research on who you've been routed to. And also, you mentioned, like, you were alluding to a actually very pernicious and hard to defeat form of surveillance certain websites use. I encourage you to look up a term called browser fingerprinting, but it's basically, to summarize it and not get too technical, it is when a company gets permission to look at your HTML5 canvas, they can determine certain hardware details about, say, your video card and things on the computer you're running, and it turns out most people's computers, when you look at enough like software and hardware details, actually are sort of unique. So they can literally use your own machine against you. Ironically, the more you have tried to protect your privacy on your machine, the more unique it makes your machine, and ironically makes you easier to identify. This is not a lot of companies use fingerprinting because it does require some fairly decent technical know-how on the part of their software team, but it is out there, and frankly, even groups like EFF don't have magic solutions for it, although there are people working on the problem. But I think to your more general point, I mean, yeah, part of the problem, as you said, is even if you're in a space online that protects your privacy, it's very easy to wander somewhere that doesn't. And I think there are a lot of people who are trying to sort of solve these problems. Actually, the inventor of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, has his own new startup right now called, I think, the Solid Foundation. I may have the name slightly wrong, but he's working on trying to sort of fix a lot of the flaws that emerged from his first attempt at the World Wide Web, and he's actually trying to introduce an idea of, in his new version of the web, you would essentially have a digital identity where your data belongs to you in the digital identity, and no website can actually take any of it from you without your explicit permission or consent. So if you got routed to some other service, that service would still have to ask you to take any of your personally identifying information. So I don't have too many great solutions other than be careful in the present. I'll just say people are working on these problems.
All right, so that was a good kickoff question. I think we've got one over here from the guy in the stealth Star Trek shirt, which is very cool.
First of all, well spotted, ma'am. So you've talked a lot about different ways of getting data from point A to point B in a more secure fashion, but a lot of people, depend on services like Dropbox or Google Drive or iCloud or whatever. And we have, some assurances from them that they're, being careful with it, but who knows? Are you aware of ways of making it easier for people to store data online, use data online, share data online in a more private way that isn't necessarily something like Nextcloud, which lets you, sort of run your own Dropbox, as it were, but that requires a lot of technical know-how, right? So how do we democratize access to that kind of stuff?
How do we democratize file sharing?
Yeah, that's a big one. And you're absolutely right that there are solutions out there, but they often require one to be pretty technically savvy. There's actually been something for almost 20 years called the Interplanetary File System, which is basically peer-to-peer cloud storage. But yes, it requires some technical know-how to set it up. There are more options than there used to be. For one thing, I can tell you that the alluded to Proton Mail, in addition to the mail and the VPN, also actually has their own version of Google Drive, essentially, Proton Drive, but fully end-to-end encrypted even on their servers. So once again, the same guarantee as with their email that even they can't look at your files. So I've not investigated it too much. I'm actually only myself really kind of deep diving into their product suite. So there may be horrors I eventually find and have to withdraw certain recommendations. But from everything I've read and researched and the people I've talked with who know more about this than me, I think it's a decent option. There are some decent non-technical things you can spin up for quick one-offs if you don't want to buy a major service. I may be getting the name slightly wrong, but there is a service online, I believe it's called CryptPad, like CryptPad, but it's basically you can spin up like a Google Doc, but it's all fully encrypted and password protected, but it doesn't really require technical know-how. It's as easy to use as Google Docs. So if you need to, have a secure document, you're communicating with people and doing some collaborative work online and want to do it securely, that's an option. But yeah, the truth is, the internet was not really built with privacy in mind. Like for the first, I don't know how many years of its existence, literally none of it was encrypted. We had to retrofit encryption onto all of it over time. So a lot of these problems are just, yeah, we know they're there, but we're just having to wait for people to build the technical solutions. And they need to be solutions that ordinary people can use. There's more than there used to be, but I do think we still have a way to go. But those would be, checking out some of those services I named would be my initial recommendations.
Awesome. So I'm going to go back in this direction again, but if anybody out there has a question, just get ready. What you got?
Can you speak to driver's license tracking, especially how it relates to current legislation?
Thank you. Driver's license tracking.
Well, that actually segues nicely into something I was going to flag as sort of a call to action before this ended. So as some of you may know, there was a recent pretty major Supreme Court case called Dobbs. And as a result, there are certain laws regarding reproductive rights that no longer are universally accessible in America. And actually, the reason this development is of major concern to privacy activists is, so as I alluded to it a bit in my talk, but I'll get into a little more detail about it now. So a lot of the U.S.'s modern rights that are based on the idea you have a right to privacy are based on a 1965 Supreme Court decision called Griswold v. Connecticut. This Supreme Court decision said that consenting married adults have a right to use contraception without government interference. And the Supreme Court arrived at this by basically inferring that the Constitution has a right to privacy, and so that right is protected by the right to privacy. This eventual right to privacy eventually became the legal undergirding of Roe v. Wade, of Lawrence v. Kansas, of Overfeld v. Hodge. A lot of modern rights are based on the right to privacy Griswold established. With Dobbs's recent overturning of Roe v. Wade, there is a lot of concern that based on the reasoning Justice Alito used, that a lot of these other rights that depend on privacy are on very shaky legal ground right now. And yes, there are absolutely concerns that a lot of the surveillance apparatus of America may be used to try to prosecute people who maybe are going to another state or a sanctuary city to obtain abortion health care related services. I'm a little less knowledgeable about the ways driver's licenses might be used for that effect, but I am fairly knowledgeable about a technology called automated license plate readers, or ALPRs. And part of why I wanted to segue into that is you all might want to know that your city council is considering tomorrow voting on giving APD access to this technology. It will be used to prosecute people coming to Austin trying to seek care that our state government does not approve of. It is too late to sign up to speak in opposition, but I encourage you, write your city council member if you don't want them to do this. There's a lot of pressure from our police department to pass this. I've been doing everything I can. I actually spoke with Council Member Kitchen earlier today, urging her to at least put a lot more legal safeguards into it. I think she listened to me, but ideally this wouldn't be happening at all, because for those of you who don't know what ALPRs are, they're basically cameras that can scan a license plate and then pull up if there's an active warrant on that license plate. But there's no way I think you can really spin that they're not a technology of mass surveillance, because they scan everybody's license plates who are driving around, regardless of whether there's a warrant or they've been accused of committing any crime. There's literally databases of millions of innocent people's license plates tracking their movements whenever they go by these cameras. And especially pernicious are the ones that are mobile, not fixed, because somebody, I don't know, might park a bunch of them near, say, a reproductive health care center and flag every license plate that is not a license plate in Austin coming there. Maybe even the state government's put a warrant on them. So, yeah, there's a lot of reason to fear technologies tracking drivers. And, I don't think I want to live in a city where that's legal. So I'd write your council members, and I'd also, it's too late to sign up to speak to council tomorrow, but hey, go down, stand in front of City Hall, make signs, protests. Make this a hard vote for them if you care about it.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good note to end on, so thank you, Kevin, for your talk. We really appreciate you, man.